What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video today, please make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of the very interesting discussion in the comment section below. If you're currently listening to us live on Spotify or iTunes, welcome in. I hope you enjoy the show as well. Please leave us a detailed review and a 5-star rating. If you're new to this channel or listening platform, please make sure you hit that subscribe button if you haven't, so you never miss another sit-down video. Welcome in, everyone. My name is Jeff Nadu, and this is episode 193 of the sit-down. And here on this channel, what we do best is interviews, and we have talked about the gamut related to organized crime over the years. We've talked to law enforcement, mobsters themselves. There's a group of people that we don't talk much to, and that's the children or family of these people that in the end we have to feel most sorry for. People we talk about are depraved, evil, and often people that steal the last dollar from you. What do their families get out of it in the end? Today we're going to speak to a man who has lived a long life. He recently authored a book about his life and the life of his father, Tommy Ryan Eboli. Tommy Ryan Eboli is really one of the most influential figures in the history of the Genovese crime family. And today we welcome his son, Xavier Eboli. Now, your real name is Severio. And I'm going to ask you, why Xavier? Why did your father name you Severio if you like the name Xavier? There's so much to get into with you, Xavier. I remember when I called you for the first time, I called you Mr. Eboli, and you said, call me Xavier.
Yeah, but it's pronounced. I pronounce it Xavier.
Xavier.
Not like Xavier.
Xavier. Well, fair enough.
Xavier.
Well, I'm happy to have you here. I recently came across some work you did with another channel, and I thought it was really well done. I ordered your book. In fact, your guy that helped you with your book, Bob, he contacted me. We got to talking, and I really wanted to speak to you. I spoke to you over the weekend, and we set a date to do this. And I'm really excited about receiving your book. I want to talk about it towards the end. It's called "The Boss in the Shadows: The Life and Death of Tommy Ryan Eboli." On this channel, we do a lot of work with the mafia, essentially from the 70s on. But your dad was very integral in the maturation of that family. You had a very interesting life in your own right. You were born in 1939. You were born in the Bronx. You lived on East 170th Street. Your early life, your eventual move into New Jersey when you were a child. What was your life like, Xavier?
Well, let me go back and just correct you 1 second. I was actually born in Manhattan.
Okay.
What was at the time Columbus Hospital on East 19th Street. I think it's around 2nd Avenue. I think today it's called Mother Cabrini Medical Center, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, my life as a child, it was confusing. Let's put it that way, because my father wasn't around very much. During the war years, we didn't even have a home. We lived 6 months out of the year in Chicago with my mother's parents. We lived in Ozone Park the other 6 months out of the year with my father's aunt, who was actually his stepmother also, if you want to call it that way. It was his mother's sister, who was married to my grandfather. So we didn't see very much of him. And I think there was some things going on that had him hiding out for a little while. I know there was a period of time where he was on the lam and hiding out up in Ellenville, New York. up in the lower Catskills. Didn't he? I don't remember him actually living with us. I'm sure he did when I was born, but I don't remember that part. It was I was about 6, 7 years old, right after the war. Was when he bought the cabin up at Greenwood Lake, and started bringing fighters up there to train at Brown's Hotel and Long Pond Inn.
So it was kind of a turbulent first couple years for you. That's the time of a child where your dad kind of teaches you things. You play catch, the normal stuff. You obviously didn't have a normal father, right?
No.
Yours was especially difficult. I'll ask though. He provided for your family, right? Like you didn't live in squalor.
That's true.
Okay.
He evidently was able to either have someone give my mother money, or he sent it himself. I have no idea.
But he just wasn't.
Don't forget, also, Jeff, there was a war going on.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
World War II had provided a large contribution to everybody's
struggle. Yeah. It wasn't a normal time. It was probably one of the more turbulent times in the last 200 years. I want to ask about your dad a little bit.
Sure.
He was originally from Manhattan. He grew up in that Greenwich Village area. I did a little research. He grew up really right off like Bleecker, like that area. Born in 1911. What do you know about his childhood? Did he ever talk to you about that?
Yes, I'm slightly familiar with his childhood. He came here to the United States when he was about a year old, maybe a year and a half. I'm not sure. His mother, and they went straight to Chicago. By the way, they didn't start out in New York.
Okay.
They went to Chicago. Where his mother came down with tuberculosis, and she wound up passing away when she was about 26 years old.
Wow.
It left him as a semi-orphan because his father was hardly ever around. My grandfather used to leave him with one of his sister-in-laws in Chicago, who was supposed to be taking care of him. He was about 4 or 5, maybe 6 years old at the time. Didn't speak a word of English. He didn't speak English till he was at least 10 years old. When he was in those early formative years, because his father was not either able or didn't want to take care of a young child, he would leave him with one of his sister-in-laws, as I said, in Chicago, who would have him sit away from the table while she fed her family. And if there was any leftovers, that's what he got to eat. She did not feed him like he was one of her family.
Why is that? I mean, you hear Italian families are quite, welcoming. They're quite big.
Yes.
Why did she treat him like that?
I have no idea.
Just upset she didn't want to take care of him, maybe?
Maybe it was that was part of it. Maybe she just did not consider him to be part of her immediate family, and that was the way it was. Consequently, around the corner on Taylor Street in Chicago, there was an Italian delicatessen, for lack of a better name, that was owned by a Saverio Porcello and his wife Marianne. They had a little girl named Mary, who was about the same age, maybe a little younger than Tommy was, and my father. and they used to spend a lot of time together. Okay, and that's where he would go to eat. They would feed him there.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, so this Saverio Porcello came from the same small town in Italy that my father was born in, a town called Shishan. This girl, Mary, grew up to be my mother. They were married in 1937.
So they were basically children growing up together, dating.
That's right. Well,
Wow.
they didn't really date. Let's put it that way.
They were
Because
just close, you know.
they were close because they played together as little children, 4,
Wow.
5, 6 years old.
That's amazing.
And as my father became a teenager, now he started to travel with his father, my grandfather, selling homemade booze because now we're in Prohibition.
Yeah.
And they would go from city to city: Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, Boston, New York. This is where he met the people that eventually he would come to be doing business with. They were young, the younger fellows that were selling illicit alcohol who grew up to be in the same life.
Got it. So he kind of eventually migrates to living in New York, right?
Right.
In the Manhattan area, starts running around with alleged hoodlums as well. But I want to go back a little to just the childhood that he had.
Now another aspect of this
Yeah.
thing is that my grandfather originally stowed away on his first trip to the United States. And while he was in stowaway, he met another stowaway. And his name was Vito Genovese. They both were stowaways on the same ship the first time they came here.
Long time ago.
And he had a reputation in Italy. So my grandfather wanted desperately to be a part of Vito's organization. Vito had the opinion that my grandfather was loud, volatile, terrible tempered, and he couldn't keep his mouth shut. And he told him that. And Vito told him that you can't be a part of my organization like that. So what did my grandfather do? He said, well, then take my son.
Wow.
And that's how my father wound up in this life.
So he was basically pushed to that. And the childhood that he had wasn't conducive. He had never really been loved. He was kind of an orphan, as you alluded to. He had to go get scraps
Right,
from neighbors.
right.
So
Exactly.
again, and I talk about this on this channel, a lot of the people that we discuss, their futures are decided already for them. So, and he was basically sold to Vito Genovese to become a hoodlum.
Well, my father had a lot of respect for Vito, and he would have walked through hot coals for him.
Yeah.
Whatever Vito said, that's the way it was.
Well, and he's a guy that, you know, a lot of people wouldn't say no to. So,
Well, that's true too.
I want
So,
to ask,
so as he grew up, though, around the age of 16, a couple of things happened to him. He went to work for Lucky Luciano, Charlie Lucky. And part of the Prohibition era, I guess a lot of these guys, they worked for different people. And Vito was part of Charlie's operations. And my father gained a lot of respect from Charlie, and at the same time, he wanted to become a boxer, and that's how he got in the fight game. Now, as we probably all know, in those days, an Italian couldn't get a fight if he stood on his head. You had to be Irish. So he picked up the name Ryan from a welterweight champion of the 1880s and 90s by the name of Tommy Ryan.
That's how I got his nickname.
And that's how he got the name Ryan, because he started fighting under the name Ryan.
And he was a pretty accomplished boxer, right?
He could have been a very good boxer. I mean, he was a good street fighter, but he was also good at the sweet science of boxing.
Right.
And he fought. Another reason why he fought under an Irish name was because he didn't. His father, my grandfather, did not want him to be a boxer. He did not want him fighting. And by the time he found out, my dad had already had 10 fights, and he had won all 10 of them. And my grandfather told me that he had to quit. That was it. He didn't want him fighting. So my father negotiated a deal with him that he would fight only until he lost a fight. Once he lost a fight, he said he would quit. So what does he do? He goes out and he loses his very next fight.
And that was it.
And that was his boxing career. 10 fights. 11 fights.
But he would become a pretty accomplished manager, right? He managed this guy, Tony Pallone. He manages Rocky Castellini, which we'll get into.
Yeah.
He manages...
Well, before that, he managed a couple. He managed a fighter by the name of Baby Sabin.
Yeah, I believe he's in this photo as well. To the left.
Yes. Baby Sabin would have been a good fighter, a better fighter. Might have had a better future if he hadn't have stepped in front of a truck on the street and wound up losing his leg. He had to have it amputated. So much damage. So my father made him a trainer, and he spent time training Tony Pallone.
Yep.
And he worked with Vincent Gigante when Vincent Gigante was fighting around 1944. He had 25 fights. Lost only 4.
Yeah, on the screen right now, I have a photo of Chan. He had 21, as you said, 4 losses. He had a couple, a bunch of KOs. When you were a child, you obviously, palled around with some of these fighters. They even lived with you, I believe, at one point when you were a kid.
Yes, that was when we went to Greenwood Lake after the war, and my father was training the fighters at either Brown's Hotel or Long Pond Inn on Greenwood Lake. They lived in our house. And that was how I got to know them. I mean, I was probably 7 years old when I first met Tony. I met Chin at the same time.
What kind of person, when you met Chin, you were a kid. What was he like?
Very, very nice. He was always good to me as a child and as a young adult and as a grown adult. I always felt that I could be very comfortable around him. He had a great personality with me. Anyway, I don't know about other people. I'm not going to even think about that.
But to you, he was always a nice guy. He's just
always a nice person, generous, good, solicitous. I can't say enough about him.
Interesting. You know, I have on the screen right now. I don't believe you can see the screen, but I have an old family photo I had found of you. I believe here you're maybe 7, 8 years old. Rocky Castellini is, I guess, kind of teaching you how to fight, and there's another child across from you. Maybe you've seen this one.
Okay, I know the picture.
What was that from?
His name is pronounced Castellani, by the way.
Castellani.
I don't know whether you have it. I don't know. Maybe it's misspelled there. I'm not sure.
What was that photo of? What were you doing there?
That photo was taken at Stillman's Gym.
Okay.
When it was there, Rocky used to train up there, and occasionally I would go up there with him. I was about, I'm going to say I was about 10 or 11 in that picture.
Wow. Yeah, that's so that would be what, the late 40s, early 50s. What a fascinating photo.
It was to be around 50 or 51.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously you're growing up. First couple of years, your dad's not around much. He then starts to be a little bit more present. He's training these fighters.
Right.
He's doing things. And look in that photo you mentioned, you were 10, 11 years old. Obviously, the truth of the matter is your dad was a mob guy, right? He did things in the streets. When did you realize that he wasn't just a boxing manager? Did you ever think about that? Was it a confusing time for you? Did you come to realize a lot of the people he was dealing with were bad people?
Now, in answer to all your questions in one sentence, I'm not sure. When I learned who he was, I think it was probably in my later teenage years that I began to realize that he was different. He didn't go to work every day. In the early years, when I was 13 years old and going to high school as a freshman, he started trying vending machine, cigarette vending machines, and at that time, we're talking around 1953, 54. He actually used to go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning. He spent a lot of hard hours building that business, and he had partners in it who didn't really put a lot of time and effort into it, but took a lot out of it. As I grew older and probably became a junior or senior in high school, I began to see that other guys, or when I was around other guys that he was with, the respect that they showed him was extraordinary. And I knew he was somebody special, but I didn't know what the mafia was or what the Cosa Nostra was. We didn't know that name in those days. And these guys never came to our house to discuss business with him. That was a no-no. He never brought the business into the house.
Yeah, which is, that's the way it's got to be. But I guess there's at some point, you would eventually become a Marine, which we'll talk about. Did he ever say to you, did you ever think about maybe wanting to be like him? He was, as you said, being introduced to you. He's a prestigious guy. You obviously knew he was into something. Did you ever want to kind of just, everybody wants to do what their father did. Did you ever want to just go into the businesses that he was in? Did he ever say to you, hey?
I didn't know what those businesses were. The only businesses that I knew he was in was the vending machine business.
Right. But did you ever have interest in doing that with him?
Well, I thought about it for a time later on in life after schooling, but by that time he had sold the business.
Okay.
He didn't have it anymore. He had the jukebox business that was separate, but the cigarette vending machine business, he sold that. I think around 56, 57. And there was some interesting little sidelights that you would think that if I had known something about who he was and what his life was like, I would have never said them. I mean, even in joking, when he told me to get a haircut, and I jokingly said to him, "Get a haircut." I said, "Look at that guy who just got killed trying to get a haircut," meaning Albert Anastasia.
Wow.
Okay. I had no, I had no idea. He
What
laughed.
did he say to you?
He got hysterical laughing. My mother looked at him, and he looked at my mother. Like,
That's great.
But I didn't know what's going on.
You just heard about it in the newspaper. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I saw the guy went and got a haircut, and he got killed while he was getting a haircut.
That's great.
So when he told me to get a haircut, I says, "You really sit in a barber chair? You'll ever get killed."
Yeah, I don't want to do that right now. It's not very safe, right? That's funny.
And I had no idea that that he was.
So you had, I mean, you like most children in the 50s of these people, you were pretty much off. And remember, most of America didn't know much about these people outside of necessarily maybe like New York somewhere. So it's not crazy to think that, and he was an old school guy. He wasn't going to come home and say, "Hey, our numbers operations did well today," or I took somebody out. That didn't work like that. Right. You would eventually become a Marine. And I'm going to show a photo of you. I believe this is, you'd come home, you and your family. It's a family photo of yours.
Mother and father, yes.
Was he proud of you that you became a Marine?
He was exceptionally proud of me. When I came home on my first leave, I flew into the old Idlewild Airport. Idlewild. Yeah, it was before it became JFK. It was a lot of construction going on there, and they didn't have jetways. They had they ran a flight of stairs up against the plane, and you got off out on the tarmac.
Right.
Anyway, he was there waiting for me, and when he saw me, I couldn't believe there were tears coming out of his eyes, literally. I'm not making that up. It was tears running down his cheek. He was so happy to see me. I couldn't get over that. And this is a man who did not come to my high school graduation for whatever reason. Never gave me a reason. Never gave me an apology. Never. So
you were upset about that?
Well, I was a little upset about it. Yeah, but you know what? It didn't bother me like it would have bothered the average kid, because he's done this to me so many times. And
so you kind of figured, this is just. Do you think it was probably just because he didn't want to be surveilled? Maybe. I mean,
I have no idea.
He just that's not the kind of guy he was.
I played baseball in high school. I played 1 year junior varsity and 2 years on a varsity baseball team. I went to high school in the Bronx at All Hallows, and I played baseball for them. And our home field was right across the street from Yankee Stadium, and we played on fields all around the city. The fields, there's a lot of baseball fields down off Houston Street on the east side, on the East River, right, actually. I played on fields in the Bronx, all over the Bronx, and as far north as the northern part of Manhattan Island. I forget what they call that area up there. We played over in the Throgs Neck area. We played in. I can't begin to tell you all these fields. Anyway, he never once came to a game.
Wow.
3 years I played baseball in high school. Do you think he would come to one game to say, I enjoyed watching you play?
Did you ever ask him and say, "Hey, like, Dad, why don't you ever come? Like, what is it about this? Why didn't?"
I never asked him to come. I never asked him to come, and I never asked him why he didn't come, because it would have only led to unhappiness. So I left it alone.
Why the sudden change of heart though when you come home from being a Marine? Do you think you just kind of hit him? You know,
I have no idea. I have no idea. It might have just hit him. I'm sure he loved me. When you read the book, you'll see that in the first chapter, I talk about a beating that he gave me when I was 8 years old for hitting my mother with a rock. Unintentional, yes. Accident, yes. Not something I would ever do on purpose.
sure.
It was an accident. It was just something that happened. And he gave me a beating that I still remember to this day exactly what happened. I mean, literally with a strap, with kicks, with punches. I was 8 years old,
You're a kid.
and when he got done, and the only way he got off me was because my mother said, "Stop hitting him, you're hurting him." And he locked me in the basement. He told me, he says, "Get down in the basement, you stay down in the basement, and don't come up until it's time for you to go to bed."
So he was a pretty. I mean, even with you, he's a pretty vicious guy. I mean,
He was a bully. Let's put it that way. He was a bully.
I'm skeptical to ask you this because, again, I don't want to disrespect you or your father, but I'm going to ask. It's alleged your father was a killer. He killed people.
I have no knowledge of any of that.
I know you don't, but I'm going to ask you. That wouldn't surprise you, right?
Would it surprise me? Well, if you're going to be a part of that life, you're going to have to learn to kill people.
Yeah.
Now, if you do, there should only be 2 people that know about it, and
You and
one of them is dead.
Yeah, right.
All
Sure.
right. So they don't talk. They don't talk about it. They don't talk about it amongst themselves. They don't talk about it like it was like it never happened.
Sure.
Okay. And
but what you're telling me is, and I'm gathering this, he obviously was a pretty, there were times where he definitely showed some wrath to you. He was a cold father at times. He didn't come to things. He was probably involved heavily in what he was doing. But then there was this switch. Now, after your time in the Marines and he sees you at the runway, did you see a change in him, or did it go back to just being?
As I matured, he became easier to live with and easier to deal with. And maybe I had something to do with that. Maybe I had, as I grew up, I gained a little bit of confidence in myself that I could talk to him. I mean, there was never a conversation about anything that we had in common. We had nothing in common when I was a kid.
Yeah.
But as I became an adult, and even later on in my 20s, don't forget I was 32 when he died. So as I matured in my 20s, I was able to talk to him a little bit about some of this stuff. In 1972, the year that he got killed, in March, you'll recall Crazy Joe Gallo got killed in that.
Yes, I do.
Umberto's steakhouse or
House.
He was at my house watching television. We were watching the news, and this thing was plastered all over the news. Now, by this point, I knew who my father was.
Sure.
And I asked him, I says, "Is this just an isolated incident, or is this going to be a problem?" He says, this is just the beginning. By the end of the year, there's going to be a lot of guys that won't be around.
Wow.
All right? That was very prophetic of him.
Yes, it was.
A month later, in April of 72, I was at his apartment one night, and he said, I need to talk to you. I says, really? I said, what about? He says, I want to tell you that there's a frame-up that's going to happen, and I'm going to be implicated in drugs. He says, and I want you to know that I have nothing to do with drugs. I never did, and I never will. I do not get involved with drugs. And I'm being framed in a drug case. Now, you piece that together with the publicity of that was created, stating that he borrowed $4 million from Carlo Gambino to buy drugs. That sounds like the same kind of frame-up that Carlo Gambino engineered with a few other guys on Vito.
Sure. It does. It very much does. And I saw where you were going with that. And look, I think one thing we can glean from the involvement your father had with the life is there was no love lost between him and Carlo Gambino. I have FBI files that state, there was a lot of issue, with things like the Copacabana and things like that.
Yes.
And there was definitely kind of an issue there. Your father was a stern man who felt that, he was on the same level as Carlo, and Carlo had issues with the way he was talking to him. And I know that a lot of rifts became between Jerry Katina and your father over his kind of, connections to Carlo. So that never made sense to me. And we'll get to your father passing away. I want to ask you about your father's brother, your uncle, Patsy Ryan, because we can glean from speaking to you that there were times where your father in your relationship was a little cold. It got better as the years went on, and he also started talking to you about things. What was your relationship like with your uncle? Did you have one? What kind of guy was he?
He was great. He was always great to me. From the time I was a little kid, I didn't get to really know him until after the war, because he was away in the Army, and by the time he got home, I was about 6 years old, and he used to take me everywhere he went, everywhere. If he was going to the store for cigarettes, or he was going to see a girlfriend someplace, come on, take a ride with me. Get in the car. But I mean, he was good to me. Let me put it to you that way. I think he saw the lack of attitude by my father, and he tried to compensate for it. I really do. But he was always very good to me. And when I was 12 years old, he confirmed me. And I had a pretty good relationship with him all the time. As I grew up, I didn't hide from his attention. Let's put it that way. There were times when I used to actually get a little jealous, because now he was married and had kids.
Yeah.
And the attention he used to give me, of course, he gave to women.
So he was kind of like a fill-in father in a way for you, right?
Well, is probably as much as he could be. He couldn't go too far with it, but he was good to me. He was always good to me.
That's great. And I want to talk to you about, obviously, his disappearance as well. But I want to go back a little to what you said right kind of near the beginning. You mentioned how close at one point your father was with Charlie Luciano. And we got to ask, you'd be a good person to ask this too. There's a growing, and this has went on for decades, that his name was Lucky Luciano. You can tell us that no one called him that, right? His name was Charlie, right?
As far as I know, I never called him Lucky. I can tell you.
So you had told me, and we obviously knew you were in the Marines. You spent some time, in Naples. We all know that Lucky spent a lot of time there.
He lived there.
Yeah, he was deported there, right? You had told me that during your time in the Marines, you actually would meet up with him regularly. That's quite extraordinary. What was that like? What did you talk about? What was your relationship with Charlie Luciano like?
Well, let's go back to the beginning on this. Just before we left for that Mediterranean cruise, I was, of course, I was stationed on an aircraft carrier with the Marine detachment. And those ships make regular deployments to the Mediterranean, where we have a very large presence. When I told my father we were going to the Mediterranean and Naples was going to be our home port while in the Mediterranean, I'd be spending a lot of time in and out of Naples. So he said to me, go and see Cockeyed Johnny. Now, Cockeyed Johnny was a good friend of my father's, and he also was deported around 1946. And he owned a little shop where he made picture frames, and he had all kinds of artists and coming in and going out. And anyway, he made a living with the picture frames. I went to see him, and of course, he was thrilled to death that I came to see him. And the point that I was getting at was when my father told me to go see Cockeyed Johnny, he said he'll take you to meet Charlie. I said, Charlie who? He said, who? Charlie who? Charlie Luciano. Who do you think? You know Lucky Luciano? I says, you know Lucky Luciano? very naively. I mean, don't forget, at this point here, I'm 19 years old. 18.
Yeah,
I was
you're
about
a kid.
19 years old. But you would think by that point in my life, I would have known more about my father's life. Okay, I knew that he had street businesses. I knew that he was a well-respected individual, and the people that were always around him were not exactly vice presidents of their companies. So it was kind of naive of me at the time, but it was funny the way it happened. Anyway, when I got to Naples, I went to see Charlie, to see Cockeyed Johnny, and he took me to a restaurant. I think it was either named the Californian or the San Francisco or something.
California, yeah.
The California.
He
Anyway,
went there a lot.
Yeah, well, he used to stop in there. He didn't eat there evidently because he mentioned that the food was garbage there.
I think it was said he went there because there was a lot of people like yourself, sailors and military folks that went there.
Well, they were probably excited to meet somebody like him.
I think it reminded him of the United States, probably.
Yeah, it reminded him of the United States, and it gave him an idea. He was like a semi-celebrity, let's say.
Sure.
Anyway, when he came into the restaurant, I was having a plate of macaroni waiting for him. He says, what is that? What are you eating? I says, a bowl of macaroni. He says, don't eat that crap. He says, come on. He says, we'll go get something good to eat. He took me up to his apartment. And as I state in the book and in my previous videos, it was a magnificent apartment. It overlooked the Bay of Naples, and it was beautifully decorated. Anyway, we had a bowl of pasta lenticchie, pasta with lentils, and it was the best I ever had. I still could picture us sitting there
Really?
in the
Wow.
sitting room. And there were other occasions where whenever I came into port, I would meet him at Cockeye Johnny's store, and we would go to the racetrack. We'd go out to dinner. We'd go to the Italian theater, which was pretty boring for me because I didn't speak very much Italian. And actually, after 6 months in the area, I was starting to pick it up a little better. If I was there for another year, I became fluent in it, I'm sure. But at any rate, he was a welcome distraction from us being in the Mediterranean, and it was really nice looking forward to going into Naples because I knew I'd see him. And if I didn't see him, I was going to my father's aunt's house, who still lived in the same little town where my father was born. And she lived right next door to my mother's cousin. So our families were still very close to each other.
Right. So you had all sorts of people to see, your family, Charlie Luciano.
Right.
So you were just kind of friends in a way. It wasn't. It had to have been quite a rush for you. I mean, you were a young kid, and you're meeting up with, Lucky Luciano was huge. He was.
It was a big name. He was still hot news in 1960. That was when I was there. It was 1960 and early 61. It was pleasant company. Let's put it that way, because I made it clear to him that I had nothing to do with their life, and we never ever discussed anything about what my father was doing. He was very, very close to my Uncle Pat. My Uncle Pat was very, very close to him. It's been said in Charlie's book, The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano, that he didn't get along with my father. And he may have had some hard feelings towards him because of my father's loyalty to Vito. Because evidently Charlie and Vito didn't get along so good, even though they were boss and underboss.
Yeah.
So if you read that book and you believe what was written, it makes it look like my father didn't get along with him. I don't believe that to be true, because my father came there to spend New Year's, and I was there. I got 4 days leave off the ship, and I stayed in the hotel with my father. And everywhere he went with Charlie, I was riding in the back seat. So I was privy to some very private conversations, not actually discussing anything current. I think they talked about the old days more than anything else. They didn't seem to have anything between them that would have indicated hard feelings.
Well, I mean, we've heard for years that it is questionable on some of the validity of that book as far as what was true and what wasn't. And
Yes.
you know firsthand, you were there.
Yes.
We all know that, Luciano died in January of 1962, not
Yeah.
far off when you were around him, and your
2
father and
years
him.
later, or a
Yeah.
year later. A year later.
Let me ask you about that day. Do you remember that day? What did you think when you heard that news?
When I heard that Charlie died, I felt sorrowful. I felt like we lost a friend.
Sure.
Uh, it wasn't like he was a total stranger to me. I mean, it's not like I had daily business dealings with him. I didn't. It was strictly a friendship.
He was just a guy that made your time in Naples, be a little bit easier,
Yeah,
as a military man.
yeah.
Wow. What a story. Obviously, I want to get into, your father by the late 60s, became what we would call a high-ranking member of the Genovese crime family. He was, as you alluded to, the boss in the shadows, a very powerful man. He had his hands in a lot of businesses, both legitimate and not legitimate. You eventually come home, and as we know, your father was killed just several months, and you shared that profound story where he said in 1972, a lot's going to go on.
Right.
In a way, he was foreshadowing his own demise. Do you think that?
I don't know. I don't think he thought that way. He was too positive an individual. He would never speak or think in a negative fashion. I think he believed that he would come out on top. If there was a war going to go on, or if there was any insurrection with other people in his own family, he felt that he could control it. I want to bring it back 1 second. You had indicated that he became the boss in the late 60s. I'm going to disagree with that, and I'm going to disagree with it because of things that I saw.
Okay.
And things that he actually said to me. Now, I got out of the Marine Corps in 1961, in April, to be specific. He was building a new home in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. And this house had to cost him quite a bit of money. He never discussed what it cost him, but based on a comparison with other homes, I would say that it was a lot of money. Now, at the same time, I met Phil Lombardo, Benny Squint, for the first time. I had never heard of this man. Had never seen him, never met him, didn't know he existed. Now, all of a sudden, as we moved to Englewood Cliffs, he's a regular. And only for private conversation with my father. It's my belief that at that time, Benny was already the boss.
That's in early 60s.
Yeah, well, my Uncle Pat had told me at one point after my father died that my father always felt that he was the boss and Benny was his consigliere. My Uncle Pat told him, as he told me that at that point, that he was in the room when Vito made Benny the boss.
Wow.
Just before he went away. When he went to jail in 1959.
Wow. So you're essentially saying that it's possible that Benny Squint Lombardo, who history tells us was the boss in the late 60s, he may have actually been boss since the late 50s.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right.
So you're saying that you believe that your father was possibly maybe a front boss in a way, or some kind of street boss?
It was either the underboss, the street boss, the front boss.
But the major decision maker, the end of the line guy, was Benny Squint.
Right.
Wow, fascinating.
And at one point in 1961, I was talking to my father. We were talking outside about something about the Copacabana, and he said to me, he says, I'm number 2 at the Copacabana. Benny is number 1.
Okay. Wow.
He says, but I'm the guy who goes there and takes care of business. He says, so whenever you want to go to the Copa, he says, it's never a problem. I think that was why we were talking about it, because I said I wanted to go to the Copa, and I wasn't sure about getting a reservation.
You didn't have much problem with him, right, getting you in there. Did you ever go? What was it like?
The Copacabana, I used to go regularly.
How was that? What was it like?
Well, whenever I went there in the early days, I guess the first time I went there was my high school prom.
Wow.
I always made a reservation through Rocky Parada, Rocky Cross, who was a good friend of Dad's. And Rocky used to take care of little things like that. He would help out with him. And if he said, Rocky, do me a favor, make a reservation at the Copa. So eventually, because now it was beginning to get a little, a bit of, I was making a pest out of myself with it. Rocky must have told my father, why don't you just set the kid up and let him go help himself whenever he wants to go there and make his own appointment. So Rocky told me, he says, go to the Copa, ask for Carmine, and tell Carmine who you are so that whenever you want to get a reservation, he'll take care of you. So when I went to the Copa, I went up there. I went to the place. I asked for Carmine. He was sort of sitting at a table doing some paperwork. I sat down and he says, how can I help you? He says, well, what do you need? I said, well, Rocky Cross told me to come and introduce myself to you and give me a reservation. He says, oh, really? He said, what's your name? Who are you? I said, my name is Xavier. And I said, my father is Tommy Ryan. The guy jumped back. He says, oh my God. He said, what? How come nobody told me this before? He said, hey, what do you need? Anytime you want to come, just call, ask for me, I'll take care of you. So, and from that point on, just like you see in the movies, when I come in, they bring a table, they carry a table over their head down, put it down in front, right in front of the band. And
I got to ask, I'm just going to ask, you had to do quite well with the women back then, I would think.
Me?
Yeah. With that kind of treatment?
I was always a one woman guy. I had a steady girlfriend for.
She enjoyed it, I'm sure.
They were slightly impressed. She was slightly impressed, not overly impressed, slightly impressed.
You kind of want the ones that aren't impressed, right? You know, that's the ones you want to stick with.
Yeah, there are some girls. I suppose you bring it to a place like the Copacabana, and it's an automatic.
Yeah, absolutely. What an interesting that would have been amazing, man. What an amazing time that probably was. I guess at that point though, you would have to have thought at some point, I kind of like this life a little bit, didn't you?
Well, I like the perks. Let's put it that way. I like the
fringe benefits,
the little fringe benefits. when you go to the Copa and there's a line for 100 feet past the front door,
And they just let you right in.
and you walk right past them,
Yeah.
and they're looking at you like, who are you? Or, who is this guy?
Yeah.
And they know that there's a lot of wise guys that go there, so they look at you like you're a wise guy. I wasn't a wise guy.
You were just a guy who had the right father, huh?
I had the right father who, like you said, the fringe benefits. It was good. It was.
I
Good.
bet it was. What an interesting life, and that's such a fascinating news that you told us about Benny Squinn. That's really something I never have heard before. Ultimately, July 16th, 1972, your father was found shot to death. I want to take it back to that day. Obviously, it's a terrible day when you lose your father. What do you remember about that day?
I woke up to a phone call at 5 o'clock in the morning. It was my younger sister. She was calling to tell me that my father had been shot and that she didn't know whether he was dead or alive, and that G.I. Joe, who was driving him that night, Joe Sternfeld, he was sitting in the car waiting for him. And when they started shooting from across the street, they shot at the car to kill him too. And he kind of laid down on the seat, and he got a lot of glass in his back from the window that had pretty much exploded. So he drove to my sister's house, and she was picking the glass out of his back most of the night. And he didn't know whether he was dead or alive, because when the shots started flying, he took off. He saw my father go down, and he took off.
Uh-huh.
So anyway, I turned on the news, the early news on television, and sure enough, it was the lead story.
And that's how you learned?
Yeah. Well, my sister told me he was shot, but she didn't know whether he was dead.
Wow.
But I saw it on television, and I immediately called my brothers in Chicago. First, I called my brother Tommy, then I called Louie, and they both got on a plane and came right away.
Let me ask you, did you ever, like, when you were in the days of going to the Copa and you were a grown man, did you ever think at some point that you would hear this news? Obviously he was in a life that was, there are very few ways out, right? You either go to prison or...
That's the interesting thing. The night that he told me about the frame that was coming,
yeah,
I said to him, I said, there's not too many guys that make it to the top.
Yeah.
That either don't get killed or spend the rest of their lives in jail.
Ain't that the truth? Yeah.
And it was kind of prophetic in a way, because 3 months later, it was all over.
Do you remember the last conversation you had with your dad?
Yeah. He stopped at my house on around dinner time on the Saturday night before, on the 15th. And he came by. My wife had just had a baby 2 weeks before that, and this was the first time he had come to see the baby. And I said, I said, we're just going to eat in a little while. I said, you want to eat? He says, no. He said, I got to go in the city. He said, I'll be out late. He says, now the next day, my mother who was in Italy, had gone to Italy. She had gone to Italy, and he was going to pick her up at Kennedy Airport. And he says, I'll pick Mom up tomorrow at the airport. He says, and I'll bring her here. We'll come here and we'll have dinner here with you. And that was that. I think that was the last thing that was said.
Wow.
And he left. And wherever he went, whatever he did, I have no idea. I don't know that he had appointments or what. The later feeling is that he was going at 1 o'clock. There was a sit down with whoever he was having problems with. I don't know who they were, but somebody had given him the word that there was going to be a sit down and for him to be there at 1 o'clock. Now, whoever he was visiting there at that location where this happened, when he left there, he left going with the intention that he was going to this sit down.
Got it.
So that was the way they drew him out of that apartment.
Got it. So they set it up, and that was that.
He was set up to so that they would know he was leaving there to go to the sit down.
You were approximately 33 years old when your father was killed.
32.
Okay, yeah, early 30s. It was around how old I was when I lost my dad. Now my dad wasn't killed,
right?
But I even had certain thoughts in my head about the doctors that were a part of it. Your father was killed by someone, and I have to would think you did you ever think about revenge? I want to get revenge for my dad, and eventually your uncle, a guy who at one point was a quasi father figure to you as well, he disappeared. You had to have wanted revenge, and I heard a story that you went to a guy that you had known for a lot of your life, Vincent Gigante, and you told me you went to the Triangle Social Club and you approached him about it. What did he tell you about it?
Well, I didn't go down there until after my uncle disappeared.
Yeah, several years later, right?
Right. My uncle, when my father got killed, my uncle gave me instructions not to go downtown at all under any circumstances. Don't talk to anybody down there. Don't go see Chin. Don't go see Fat Dom. I was pretty friendly with Fat Dom also. And he said, don't go down there. Don't talk to them. Don't talk to anybody. And if you don't go down there, you shouldn't have any opportunity to talk to them. Now, he didn't tell me why. He didn't say, here's the reason why. He just told me, do as I tell you. Don't talk to anybody. So for 4 years, I didn't go downtown. I never stopped down there. And that was the way my uncle wanted it. So after my uncle disappeared in 1976, I went downtown to find out if they knew where he was or did they send him someplace. We had no idea that something happened to him because there was no shootings or no indication of foul play. He just disappeared. So when I went down there, I saw Fat Dom first, Dominic Alongi. I asked him, I said, Dom, you know what's going on with my uncle? I says, he hasn't been around for a few days. He says, no. He says, as far as I know, he says, if you went anywhere, he didn't tell us where he went. So I left it at that. I ran into Mario Gigante. Mario said to me, he says, "I'll talk to you like you're one of us." He says, "We had no idea." He was in very good stead. This is his exact words. He was in very good stead. He says, "There's no reason why anything should have happened to him." So at that point, I went into Chin's apartment, and Chin says, first thing he said to me is, "Where have you been?" He says, "How come you haven't been around here?" I says, "Well, my uncle asked me not to come down." He says, "Why would he do that?" I says, "I don't know. He probably figured I'd say something stupid to you, and he didn't want me to embarrass him." That was what I told him. He says, "Well, how come you're down here now?" I says, number one, I says, "I'm trying to find out what's going on with my uncle. He disappeared. He hasn't been around." I says, "Other than that," I said, "I do have some questions about my father." He says, you could ask me anything you want, anytime you want." He says, "You don't have to be bashful or afraid of anything." He says, "You come and see me anytime you want." So he says, "Come on, let's sit down." So we sat down in the living room. He says, "What do you want to know?" I says, "First of all, what's with my uncle? Where you know where he's at? Did you send him out of town? Did he go out of town on business? What's the story?" He said, "No idea." He said, "We didn't know he was missing. We didn't know he wasn't around." So I left it at that. What was I going to say to him? And then he said, "What do you want to know about your father?" I said, "I want to know about my father. Why a man of his stature should be shot down in the street and left in the gutter like that." I says, to me, that's demeaning. I says, "Why couldn't he just been made to retire?" His answer to me was, and I quote, "Be glad that you have a grave to go to." He says, "Look at your aunt and your cousins. They don't have a grave to go to." So what was he telling me? I don't know.
I don't either.
I left it like that. I basically said to myself, don't ask any more questions.
And you would tell me, and I know you'll tell everyone else, that was the last you ever, I believe, had any run-ins with those people, right? You kind of then went on with your life, and you eventually built businesses for yourself. You created a life for you and your family, and now, many years later, you're here, and all these people
Yeah,
that we are talking about, Chin, and
they're all
all,
dead. They're all
they're all,
dead.
yeah, they're all, even Mario, they're all gone,
Oh yeah.
and looking back, I think I'll ask you, you're one of the only people I've ever talked to. I actually wanted, before I ask you the question, I want to thank you, to be honest, for telling your story. Because one thing that I have a major issue with in the genre that I'm in is so many people never tell their story. And this is a world where we are left with a lot of questions about things. And I really commend you for talking about this, writing this book, and we're going to talk about it. I'm happy that you did, because this has been one of the most profound interviews I've ever done. I've learned so much. People ask me all the time, "What's your favorite interview?" And I got to tell you, this is going to be on the short list of my favorites. I'm fascinated by you. So you kind of realized that night when you talked to Chin, I'm not asking any more questions. These are
Right.
people who,
They're
they
not going
did.
to tell you. They're not going to tell you anything anyway. Let's
Right,
put it
right.
that way.
But did you kind of view that as, okay, I'm going to let my father and uncle rest. I'm never going to get answers probably. And I need to stay away from these people, because if I ask too many questions, I mean, it's not out of the question to think that they may do something to you, maybe.
Well, they may have thought that way. It's always possible. They're not going to let on that they are thinking that way if that's the case.
Yeah.
You know, I do mention in the book that in around the year 2005, I was living in Florida at the time. I met Mario and his wife, and me and my wife. We had dinner together in a restaurant in
Wow.
Sarasota. And Mario made a point of telling me that they were all very proud of the way I conducted myself after my father's demise. And they were pleased that I didn't say anything to anybody, didn't talk to anybody. And in general, they were proud of the way I conducted myself.
Well, I'm not gonna ask because I don't think you'll answer, and I respect that. I guess
Yeah.
I'll just leave it open ended. What do you think happened? Why do you think this happened? Do you think it was just part of that world, that business? You don't really think much about it?
It's not that I don't think very much about it. I wish I knew more about it because it might answer questions that I have in my own mind.
Yeah.
And this is something that happened over 50 years ago, and it still preys on my mind every day. I wish, you know, I know that in that life, when something happens to a person, if he's got a brother or a son in that life or two, he's next on the list.
Right.
There's no way you survive that unless you go first and get whoever you think did it. So, yeah. And like I said before, there's only two people who know about it, and one of them's dead.
Yeah, right. So there's not much to glean. I got two questions, and I want to talk about your book, and then we'll get you out of here. Like I said, this has been excellent. You mentioned your brother, Louis Eboli.
Yeah.
He was a guy from out in Chicago.
Right.
He did go a different way than you. It's alleged that he was a member of the Chicago outfit. I have to ask, I mean, he could have did something about revenge. Do you know anything about that? Do you know it? Do you as to why?
It's been said that he was put in house arrest so that he wouldn't do anything. It's been said. I don't know. I never heard anything about it.
And that could have caused some major friction between two pretty strong groups of people.
Yeah, he was he was near the top in the Chicago outfit. He was you know, he grew up in that life. On his mother's side, he had an uncle who was pretty high up there.
Yep.
He had an uncle through marriage, was married to his mother's sister, who was also pretty high up there. And he had his mother had another brother who was not so high up there, but he was a wise guy.
They were all pretty connected, though.
They of course, they were very large suppliers of alcohol to Al Capone during Prohibition.
Oh, yeah.
That family, the whole family. And that was how my father got involved over there, was because my grandfather was selling them alcohol,
Right.
that they were in turn passing on to Al Capone.
Right.
And it was through that relationship that my father met Anne, who wound up being his first wife.
And just to kind of let everyone know, you and Louis had different mothers, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Louis and Tommy both, their mother was Anne Ariola.
Did you Just did you spend much time with them as as a kid or anything?
I used to go hunting with my brother Tommy quite a bit. I would see him whenever I went to Chicago. He used to come to New York once in a while if there was a wedding or for any reason. I mean, there was. I mentioned in the book that when things started to get a little uncomfortable, I guess my father sent for Louis, and Louis came, and I picked him up at the airport. And when I brought him to my father's apartment in Fort Lee, Dad was waiting with Rocky Cross downstairs. They were waiting for us to come. So when they started to get in Rocky's car, and I started heading for my car because I figured they were going to talk business, and that was none of my business. And my father said, "Why don't you come with us?" I was shocked. I was totally shocked. And so we're riding in the car, and he's telling Louis that he needs help from Chicago because these people over here, they no longer have the respect for what Vito stood for, which means that they probably wanted to use drugs or sell drugs, and he didn't. And he says, things are going to get out of hand. I don't know whether I'm going to be able to control it, and I'm going to need some help.
Wow.
Okay. Now, later on, evidently, when things were really getting bad, he was looking for help from Tony Accardo. But
Wow.
Tony Accardo was on a fishing trip somewhere out in the Atlantic, and they couldn't get a hold of him.
Yeah.
And they couldn't give him any help unless Tony Accardo approved it.
Wow. So your dad was effectively trying to go through his own son to Chicago to maybe get some assistance with his bigger problem. Wow.
Right.
Fascinating. So yeah, your brother was pretty important. He died pretty young, right? He was like young.
He was 52. He died of pancreatic cancer at age 52. And my other brother, Tommy, I believe he was about 60 or 61.
Wow. It's all very young. Wow.
And he died of pancreatic cancer also.
So, you're really, you're 85 now. You've lived a life, you've built a family, you've built businesses. You've built a life for yourself away from that life.
Yes.
I guess looking back on everything, I mean, what made you want to write a book? Is it just kind of to tell these stories? What?
I didn't want to write a book. That's the truth of the matter. And one of my sons, Mike, and a dear friend of mine, Anthony Aversa, have been telling me for the last 5 years, you really ought to write a book about some of these things. Because I would tell them little stories here and there.
Yeah.
Nothing that would have affected anybody anyway. And every time I would tell them a story, they go, you really ought to write a book. So about a year, it's a little over a year ago, September, Tony Pallone was inducted into the New York State Boxing Hall of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
And at the awards dinner, his son, Neil, who I know for a long time, Neil met Bob Cassidy. Bob Cassidy is a writer for Newsday. He's written articles that have appeared in the L.A. Times, Baltimore Sun, the New York Post. He's a pretty accomplished journalist, and he's written 4 books. Most of them are all sporting books. Now, his dad was a fighter in the 70s, 80s. Irish Bob Cassidy was his name. So he was at the dinner covering it for the newspaper when he asked about Tony Palone. They pointed him to Neil, and Neil talked to him, and he asked about what he knew about his father's fighting. And he says not a whole lot, because he had retired by the time he was born. He says, but you know what? He says his manager, Tommy Ryan, his son, he lives in Jersey. He might be able to tell you. He might be able to help you out. So he gave Bob my number with my permission. He called me first. Yeah, can I give him your number? I said, yeah, tell him to call me. So Cassidy called me, and it turns out that through conversation, we decided to write a book.
Well, I'm really glad you did. And I'm showing the book on the screen right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to include the link to purchase it in the pinned comment of our video.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah, I urge everybody. This has been one of my favorite interviews I've done. I mean that. I really urge you guys to go out and get it. I get questions all the time about what book should I buy, and we have so many people that love this history in this world, and we have a lot of boxing fans even. So I urge everyone to go get the book. Just a tremendous story. I got to ask you, Xavier, do you watch any of this type of content on the internet, like the mafia content? Do you watch any of it?
Oh yeah, I get a kick out. I get a kick out of it because some, especially the videos about Chin, because I knew him so well.
Yeah,
or at least as well as I would think. Somebody who knows him. I don't say that I didn't socialize with him. Let's put it that way.
But you knew him more than most people.
But I know him more than most. Anyway, when you know somebody, you find it interesting, or so you watch it. I didn't know Gotti. I didn't care to know Gotti. That's a guy who should have been a walking time bomb. All the other ones, I didn't know Fat Tony. I didn't know any of the Gambinos or the Colombos.
Well, that's actually the last question I wanted to ask you. Your dad was a part of a life in the time that he was, where it was at its height, right? Just a very strong contingent of people that ran essentially New York City. Okay, and we look at the mafia today, which I talk about. It's 2025. It's a significantly different group, right?
Right.
Do you find it interesting of where it went? You mentioned John Gotti, a guy who people use as a lightning rod. John Gotti was obviously very detrimental to his own end, and the RICO Act was very damaging. People like Joey Messino, who had become a boss who cooperated, right? I guess I'd ask, like, what do you think your dad would have thought of all that stuff?
He wouldn't have been very happy about it, because the MO that guys like my father had, the old timers, was keep to themselves. Don't brag about who you are or what you've done. And John Gotti was the antithesis of that. John Gotti was always looking for publicity, always wanted to be on television, always wanted. He just couldn't go without publicity.
Were you I also want to ask about Chin. Were you surprised with the little ruse Chin put on? Because you knew him as very different. He wasn't obviously a babbling lunatic.
No.
Were you surprised that he put that little ruse on?
No, because he did the same thing my father did. My father did that.
Did he?
Oh, absolutely. He had one serious heart attack. The first
Oh,
one.
I remember. Sure, he had there's supposed to be a few. Yeah.
The first one he had was in the spring of 1968. He was in Holy Name Hospital in Teaneck, New Jersey. He was in there for a month. Now, that was 1968, and Benny Squint used to come up there every day. He'd come up to the hospital to see him. And after that, he faked about 2 or 3 heart attacks to get out of going in front of these hearings that they were setting up.
So the general thought was, we'll pretend to either be very sick or a lunatic, and it'll get us. I mean, it's smart. I mean, it probably in the end it worked, I guess.
It did. I mean, they talk a lot about the heart attack that sent him to NYU Hospital. That seems to be always one that's talked about. When I was in my car in the city when supposedly he had that heart attack, and they announced they had it on the radio, on the news. So I immediately ran right over to NYU Hospital. I went up there, and as I walked into the room, I said to him, I said, "Are you okay?" He winked at me. Like, don't say anything.
So it was a ruse.
That was a ruse.
Yeah, I guess looking back, I mean, it's a smart way of doing things, and it worked. Right. So, hey, good for him.
And after that, Chin started doing it.
Absolutely. So it made sense. Xavier Eboli, what an incredible talk. I bought your book over the weekend. I know a colleague of mine, RJ, he bought it as well. I urge everybody, go buy this book. I think it's probably going to be a must-have in your collection. What an amazing story. And I give you credit on 2 things. Building a life that was not the status quo of your family. You went and did something good for society. You built a life, a family, businesses. And I wish you all the best in health. And I hope the book really does well. I think it's going to do good for you.
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate the opportunity to be on your show.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm always glad to talk about it. Some of the things that we talked about today are taken a little out of chronological order, but I want to impress upon you that one thing that I did say about Benny Squint being the boss.
Yeah.
From the time Vito went away. And at that point, I believed that my father was the front boss or the street boss or the underboss, whatever you want to call him. But I called him, I believe the name of the book, The Boss in the Shadows, is appropriate because throughout the 60s, you hear very little about what took place with the Genovese family. And because it was not a big deal in the press, people didn't know about him. And he was in the shadows. And
I think it's a great title.
Yeah, that's the way he wanted it. He didn't want the publicity. He didn't want people to point fingers and say, "Look who that is."
Absolutely. Well, I'm really glad you wrote it. I'm really glad that Bob helped you, and I'm really glad that you got in touch with me. And I, as I said, I urge everybody to go check it out. I'm going to include the link in the pinned comment in the description of this video. Maybe we'll speak again, Xavier. I would really enjoy that.
I'd look forward to it. I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
And thank you for coming on and being so open. Just a fascinating life, and I wish you and your family all the best.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Thanks, everybody, for watching. We'll see you next week here on The Sit Down.